Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our program, The Writing on the Rosenwald, the Dahmer Family Story. I just want to give people a couple of minutes, or not minutes, but a little bit of time to join. But thank you all for joining us. We have a really great discussion tonight. We're going to be using Andrew Feiler's temporary exhibition, A Better Life for Their Children, to explore the story of the Dahmer family and their connection to the civil rights movement and to the Rosenwald Schools. And before we get started, just a disclaimer that all comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. With that being said, I want to introduce our moderator, Mr. John Spann. He's a program and outreach officer at the Mississippi Humanities Council. Originally from Columbus, Mississippi, John has lived in the Jackson metro area since 1997. Shortly after graduating from Mississippi State University with a BA in history, he joined the museum division staff of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. During his 5 years with MDAH, he became an inaugural member of the curatorial team for the 2 Mississippi museums. As program and outreach officer, John oversees and develops council-conducted programs such as Ideas on Tap and the More Perfect Union Initiative. Thank you for being with us tonight, John, and now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kara. I want to first off thank the National Center for Civil and Human Rights for allowing me to be a part of this program and give me the opportunity to moderate this great discussion. I'm going to go ahead and introduce one of the first guests today, Andrew Feiler. Andrew Feiler is a 5th-generation Georgian, having grown up Jewish in Savannah. He has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Andrew has long been active in civic life. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple not-for-profit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials and political candidates. His art is an extension of his civic values. Thank you, Andrew Feiler, and we're going to let you go ahead and start your presentation.
Great. Thank you. First of all, let me just say it's great to be with the Dahmers again. John, it's great to share the stage with you. Thank you for what you do for humanities in Mississippi. This book came out on May 1st. It is already in its 3rd printing. It's been featured in the Wall Street Journal and Smithsonian Magazine and Preservation Magazine, Architect Magazine. So it's really the receptivity to the telling of the story has been incredibly gratifying. And the exhibition, as you know, is open now at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, where it will be open through mid-December. And the exhibition will then be traveling to Charlotte, Memphis, Nashville, New Orleans, Richmond, Virginia, and beyond. So for those who might be joining from afar, I hope you'll get to see the exhibition when it comes close to your community. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit. I'm going to just sort of do an introduction here about this work and cue up the broader conversation with the Dahmers. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, John, is that looking okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. A Better Life for Their Children, Julius, Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 schools that changed America. Let me start by introducing the characters. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grew up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to Springfield, Illinois today, you will see that there is a 4 square-block area in downtown Springfield, the Lincoln home historic site. And across the street is Julius Rosenwald's birth home. And there's now a plaque outside, but when I was speaking with Peter Ascoli, who was the biographer of Julius Rosenwald, he told me he had gone down to Springfield to research Julius Rosenwald's life, and he was meeting with the superintendent of the National Historic Site in his home and said to him, in his office, and said, "Do you know where Julius Rosenwald's birth home was?" And he said, "You're sitting in it." So Julius Rosenwald grows up in Springfield, Illinois, and he rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. He helps turn Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era with innovations like Satisfaction Guaranteed or Your Money Back. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause was what later becomes known as civil rights. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill Rosenwald School in Bartow County, Georgia. Now, the other major force in this program is Booker T. Washington. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs in the president's home at Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in Virginia. He attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and he is the founding principal of the historically Black college, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, the two men meet in 1911. In fact, May 18th of 1911, this is the 160th, the 110th anniversary of this year is the 110th anniversary of their meeting. This is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt that hangs in the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. On the rededication of the event to commemorate the restoration, the rededication of the school, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt. So the two men, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse, and is in fact an image from inside that schoolhouse that is on the cover of this book. And if you look in the far left corner, you can see this quilt hanging in the schoolhouse. So these two men meet in 1911. And Julius Rosenwald agrees to go on the board of Tuskegee Institute. But the two men keep talking. What can they do together? And they form one of the earliest collaborations between Jews and African Americans in the cause of civil rights. And they create this program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. And I want to be clear about I want to be clear about the genius that is in the details of this program. This is a portrait of students and teachers in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Eastern Kentucky. The Rosenwald Schools program, they reach out to the Black communities of the South and they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and if you will go to the school board, the white school board, and while we welcome their contribution, what we need them to do is to agree to own, maintain the school and pay for the teachers, staff the school. If you do, and we're doing this because we want to create a deliberate Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress. If you do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. And think about this. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants the Black community has to contribute, and one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership where the white school board has to participate. Now, before I get off this slide, I want to pause and talk a little bit about the importance of these photographs. Photographs like this of students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities, become a regular feature of the history of these schools. And in fact, the program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee. And Booker T. Washington has these photographs made, and he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who is so moved, and he writes back that he has been so moved by seeing these photographs that he is committing to expand the program. And all of my work prior to this body of work was in color. This body of work is entirely black and white and horizontal in homage to these photographs and the visual narrative of the history of this program. So they have reached out to the Black communities and the white school boards And from 1912, when the people behind the Lochapoka School in Lee County, Alabama, become the first community to raise the matching funds and build the very first Rosenwald School, until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the last Rosenwald School, the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County. 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 states. And the results are transformative. There are two economists in the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South prior to World War I. But between World War I and World War II, that gap closes precipitously, and the largest single driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Maya Angelou, Medgar Evers, 4 or 5 of the members of the Little Rock Nine, who go on to integrate Little Rock Central High School, Congressman John Lewis, all went to Rosenwald schools. Now, this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, built in around 1915, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald school. Remember, the program begins in 1912. And I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until I found myself in February of 2015 at lunch with Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African-American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. I had just turned in my first book to my publisher. It would come out later that year. I was thinking that book was about uses abandoned education spaces, the abandoned campus of an historically Black college, to frame a discussion around how education has been the backbone of the American dream, the access point to the American middle class. And I was thinking about what I was going to do next. And Jeannie is the one who told me about Rosenwald schools. And the story shocked me. I am a 5th generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my whole entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? And I came home and I Googled Rosenwald schools. And what I found was that there were some academic books on the topic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And I set out to do exactly that. And I want to talk just briefly about I knew this was an amazing story, but how do you tell it visually? And I started out with exterior images. This is what's known as a one-teacher school. This is the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia, a 2-teacher school, a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Notice these were all small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, otherwise known as Little Rock, Arkansas. But the story that these exteriors told was incomplete. Because of the original 4,978 schools, there's only about 500 that survive. Only half of those have been restored. And very few of these schools are still in use for educational purposes. They were simply outgrown as educational institutions long ago. The Dunbar School is one of the rare Rosenwald schools that are still in use for educational purposes. In fact, of the 105 schools that I went to, and I shot over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles. I shot 105 of these surviving schools. Only 5 of those 105 schools that I visited are still in use for educational purposes, which means that to preserve these schools, they had to have been adaptively reused. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters in Cass County, Texas, who sold quilts to raise money to restore the Pleasant Hill School and turn it into the community center that it is today. They gather most Mondays in the school to quilt. So community centers is one of the sources of adaptive reuse. Some of them have been turned into church halls, the Denby School in Virginia. Others are museums, the Warfield School in South Guthrie, Tennessee. But many of these schools, this is the Hannah School in Newberry County, where the graveyard of the Hannah AME Church across the street has grown up around the school. Many of these schools remain distressed, at risk of collapse. and this is a plea for preservation because these schools are the locus of history and memory and education in their communities. And it's really important to preserve these schools. But as I decided I needed to tell this adaptive reuse narrative, suddenly I had to get inside of many of these schools, and that meant I needed permission. And it was then that I met all of these extraordinary individuals. I'm going to tell you one story and then cue up the conversation with the Dahmers. This is Frank and Charles Brinkley inside the K. Rose School in Tennessee. The photograph of Julius Rosenwald over this doorway has hung in this school since the schoolhouse was built in 1923. Frank and Charles Brinkley both attended this school. They went on to college, they went on to graduate school, and they became educators. Frank taught high school math and science. Charles became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all of whom went through this school, all of whom went to college. And these 6 siblings had 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened without this schoolhouse. Now, I will simply say this is the Bay Spring School. And the afternoon that I spent with the Dahmers inside the Bay Spring School was one of the really high watermarks of this experience for me. We had an incredible conversation. They were gracious with their time. This is a beautiful schoolhouse that has been beautifully restored. It has a tremendous civil rights history. I'll defer to the Dahmers to tell you those stories. I will bring you briefly inside the schoolhouse. This is the portrait of Ellie Dahmer, who I'm thrilled is participating in this conversation today. Her son Dennis is joining us as well. Ellie Dahmer did attend a Rosenwald school. Her husband attended this Rosenwald school. She was a teacher in this school until it closed. And the Dahmer's son, Dennis, who's on the podium today, led the restoration of this schoolhouse. So with that as introduction, I will stop sharing my screen and John, turn the program over to you.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful presentation on the topic that we are getting into today. And I want to introduce Mr. Dennis Dahmer. Dennis Dahmer grew up in the Kelly Settlement community north of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, along the Forest and Jones County line. This area was settled by his ancestors in the early 1800s before Mississippi was a state. His ancestors were African enslaved and free people, Indian, Irish, and German. It was this racial makeup that led to a lot of his family's racial conflicts with others going back to the 1800s. He was part of the group of Black students that integrated North Forest High School in 1970 and graduated from Jackson State University with a BS in biology. Today, he is semi-retired and focusing on nostalgia farming in the Kelly settlement. We also have Miss Ellie Dahmer, who, as Mr. Feiler has said, is, I think, the last living teacher of the Bay Spring School. And she is also civil rights, I would say civil rights activist and wife of late civil rights hero Vernon Dahmer. So we're glad to have all of you on the dais today. And I would let Mr. Dahmer, if you wanted to say a few words before we get started, you can.
Dennis, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now. Thank you, John. My mother and I were happy to participate in the program today. I'll just give you a brief overview of the history of this particular school here, which is, and I'll be brief about it. The school actually started somewhere around 1866, 1867, right after the end of slavery. Prior to the school being formed, the members of this community, known as the Kelly Settlement, which was a mixture of African-American individuals, mixed race individuals. Some of them had been enslaved and some of them had actually were free. The first thing they did, they formed a church. which was the Shady Grove Baptist Church, located approximately 3 miles from this location. That happened about 1864, somewhere thereabouts, before the Civil War ended. In that church, those same members decided to start a school for their kids. They started at school around 1866, 1867. The first teacher was the preacher, probably one of the few that may have actually been able to read and write. Then in about 1877, somewhere thereabouts, the school was moved from the church to its present location. So what happened again, those same families that had come up this Kelly Place and other farms in this area, a lot of them were related, they were cousins. They got together again. They came to this site on land that was donated by Warren Kelly, a mulatto, my great-grandfather. They cleared the land and they built another log cabin structure, and they named it the Bay Spring School because it sits on a ridge above a bay that has these live spring heads that feeds that bay. This area was also an area where those early settlers came to the spring heads to dip out water with their mules and wagons and barrels and buckets to carry back to their home. So the school was started by these individuals who had come out of 1865 slavery area. And they did this on their own. They were a self-sufficient group of people. Most of them were farmers, all of them were farmers, primarily cotton farmers. And they were self-sufficient. They wasn't wealthy, but they were able to survive and take care of themselves. So they built the school. Then later on, probably in the late 1800s, that's when Forest County started getting involved in supporting the school. They got involved with the Rosenwald Program in the 1900s, and there were at least 2 buildings on this site that were Rosenwald design buildings. The one that we're sitting in today, which I think was floor plan like number 19 or 21, I can't remember. Then there was also a 2-story education building here. And in total, there was about 5 buildings that was on this site in use when the school closed in about 1958. And everybody was consolidated, everybody black at least was consolidated into a new building in the middle of Forest County. So this school was started by people in this community for their kids, maintained and financed by them from the very beginning. And when the school board got involved, they continued to participate and do things to fund the schools. Now, my mother can tell you about the school that she went to, which was the Jasper County Training Center in Jasper County, Mississippi, and some of the things that went on up there in that school, if you're interested.
Okay. Well, thank you. We're gonna go ahead and get started now with the interview, the panel discussion. I first want to direct the question to you, Mr. Feiler, about the book particularly. It's a great book. It's beautiful pictures. Like you stated in your presentation, you started off doing things on the outside of the structures, but since, John Lewis has recently passed, and I noticed that the foreword was done by him. How did you get him involved in it, and how did you get him to particularly write this foreword for the book?
So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years before I decided it was safe to come back to the South. And I have been back in Atlanta now for 26 years, and for 25 years, in fact, that entire time I have lived in the 5th Congressional District. And so for 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's. And Congressman Lewis was surely the most prominent surviving alum of a Rosenwald School when I was in the process of working on this. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis's office And I asked if he would do the introduction to my book. And he said to me, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald Schools. And I said, Congressman Lewis, there's 3 other essays in this book. Jeannie Syriac, who, as I mentioned, introduced me to Rosenwald Schools, who originated the role of African-American heritage specialist at the State Historic Preservation Office. She's writing the central history of Rosenwald Schools and her story of how she encountered Rosenwald Schools. There is the founding director of the African American Heritage Action Fund of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He has an afterword in my book. I wrote an essay in this book. I think all of these we have the history covered. Congressman, what I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to be a student there? What role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I can do that. And so in late October of 2019, I found myself sitting around the round table of Congressman Lewis's office, working with him on this introduction. And it was after that session that I did his portrait in his office. And this was actually October 29th of 2019. And exactly 60 days later, on December 29th of 2019, he went public with his pancreatic cancer diagnosis. So the writing of the introduction to this book is one of Congressman Lewis's final public acts. And I would simply say that I didn't start this project knowing that I would have the extraordinary opportunity to learn from Mr. Dennis Dahmer, from Ms. Ellie Dahmer about their history and their experiences in the civil rights movement, or to spend hours with Congressman Lewis in his office. But what an extraordinary gift. And his introduction is really exquisite. And it's an honor to have him as part of this project.
Yeah, most definitely. I know that is dear to you as, the author of that book, to have one of the last public things for him to do before he passed away was to write the foreword. So that's beautiful. Since we're talking about, prominent people who went to Rosenwald Schools, I want to direct this next question to Miss Ellie Dahmer. You yourself are the last living teacher of the Bay Springs School in Kelly Settlement. How important is that school to your family? And how did it come that how did you become a teacher there? And also, could you show more significance with like the civil rights movement, moving from school to like voting rights hubs and things like that?
Yes, I was the last one to teach here at Bay Springs School. They needed a home economic teacher down here, and I majored in home economics in college. I finished college in 1947, and I worked first in Jasper County, and then later I came on down to and worked in Forest County. But let me tell you a little bit about the school I attended. I attended school in a church until I was in the 8th grade. That's when they built the first Rosenwald School. Each family that owned property had to give something to build a school. We had timber growing. They needed pine trees. They would come in, select the pine trees, measure them, cut them, and then send them to the sawmill. This is what the family gave to support the school here. Later on, the school was it was organized into from kindergarten through 12, from 1st grade through 12. We didn't have kindergarten then. Later on, they taught the older students how to paint. And then they painted the school. First, it was just a wooden school without any paint. Later on, they was able to paint the school. And most of the schools at that time, they had some kind of, the heat they had was furnished with a wooden heater. And the community people cut the wood and brought it to the school to keep the children warm.
Okay.
So you want to tell him about Bay Springs and how it came about, about the civil rights end of it, how the building was used maybe during the civil rights era here with Daddy.
Okay, yes. During the time Vernon Dahmer lived here, this Bay Spring School is kind of off the road. You wouldn't see it. The trees and things kept it shaded from the road. People that he could get to go down to Forest County to try to register, they would leave the cars here and they would get in our car. They already had our tags on our car. He didn't want them to go through the same thing that we were going through with. So he shielded them from that. He would pick them up here at this center and bring them back here.
Gotcha. So it seems like just now, hopefully we could talk more about how the schools itself were more than just education centers. They were, could be used as churches and places to, for safe haven or register people to vote. This is a question for for all three of y'all. Could y'all kind of lend a description or information on how these schools were used beyond just educational centers, besides, the everyday thing that we know of?
Let me, I can deal with that. I can address that at kind of at a high level on how these schools generally were used. And then the Dahmers can address how that was done specifically at Bay Springs. The schools, most of these schoolhouses were intentionally designed to be used for schools during education hours and to be community centers after education hours. And many of the schools had a form of a room divider that was usually a series of doors that could be closed off to separate education spaces during education hours, or folded back, kind of like an accordion, to open up the space for its use as a community center after hours. And so this idea of school as community center, structure as community center, public investment as a community center was built. It was designed into the program from its very, very beginning.
Yeah. So would you say that these schools were built to also help cultivate community? And
yeah. And I want to go back to one thing that Ms. Dahmer was talking about, because when I neglected to mention this up front. When the Rosenwald program goes to the Black communities and says, if you will contribute to a school, they accept it as that contribution: land, cash, land, material, or labor. And Ms. Dahmer was just giving some really good examples. Timber, that was material. Painting the schoolhouse, that's labor. And all of that got put into this formula that added up to the African-American community's contribution to their schoolhouse. And the other important thing to remember, the African-American community that is having to contribute to the construction of these schools is already being taxed to pay for white schools. Yep. And so they are digging deeper to help, and that speaks to the importance of education. And I'll simply add one thing. I was in Louisiana at the Plaisance School, which is actually one of the very few Rosenwald schools that is still actively in education space. And I went in to talk to the principal after I had done this photograph. I called her in advance to tell her I was coming. I didn't want to think a strange person out in front of an active elementary school taking pictures was like worthy of calling the police. So I went to talk to her, and she actually really knew a lot. She had studied the history of the school where she was the principal, and she's the one who talked to me. This is a school where 70% of the money came from the Black community. And she says to me, marveling at that commitment to education, they worked and they strove and they did what they could to make a better life for their children, because in their minds, education was liberation. And it is from that conversation and that line that the title of this book, A Better Life for Their Children, comes.
That's great. I'm glad you answered, because I was going to ask that question to you. We were just talking about cultivating community and how these education centers were doing that. Ms. Dahmer had alluded to how it was used in the civil rights movement. The Bay Spring School was used during the civil rights movement, and how her late husband was able to give safe haven to people who wanted to vote or learn about their voting rights. Could you and Dennis talk more about the other things that the school was used for, like community centers, as Mr. Fielder was talking about?
Let me talk a little bit more about Jasper County. I forgot to tell you the main thing. My father gave the land that the school was built on.
Okay.
And during the time Vernon Dahmer was trying to get people to register to vote, they would hold programs like SNCC, and other people would have mass meetings here in this center here that nobody knew anything about.
Yeah, the building, it was used for a lot of things. One of the agreements they had with the county school board is, once the schools closed, ownership reverted back to the family. So the land and the buildings came back to us. So we were able to do a lot of things with it. So during that time, segregation, you didn't have Black community centers, okay? Didn't exist. So this building became like a community center, ball field in front of it, playing baseball out there. They are doing fundraising events for the local church or whatever organization, like fish fries, whatever. They're having mass meetings here. Some of the buildings were used for storage during the civil rights movements for materials that were being shipped south. It was later used as a Head Start center when the Head Start program started. It was used for that. After that, it became a Pentecostal church. So the building has pretty much been in use pretty much all of its life in some form or fashion. Now, for any of your viewers that are interested, they can go online and just do a search for Dahmer Picnic, all right, Freedom Summer Picnic. And you'll find a lot of pictures, primarily from the University of Southern Mississippi Civil Rights Archive, that shows a big picnic that my dad threw for the Freedom Summer workers when they were first coming to Mississippi for that campaign. So it's always been an integral part of this community, this school. That was one of the reasons why I was interested in restoring the building, to try and maintain some of that history and legacy of the type things that went on out here. And in the future, we're going to be doing more community type events. You came down and attended one, John, after the statue dedication, you and the other folks from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. So periodically we plan to do that. We plan to have guest speakers coming in, to talk about civil rights history, current events, just basically to try and educate people and to keep them involved and informed.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad that Ms. Dahmer had brought up the fact that her father had donated the land for the school that she had attended, because, a lot of Black land ownership were essential to a lot of these schools being successful. And definitely in the South, there was a lot of Black landowners between these times, like these late 1800s into the 1900s. I think in Mississippi, or there was like over 1 million acres owned by African Americans during the early and late 1920s and 40s. So that's a big deal. We were talking about how the schools were being used as community centers, and and other things besides the school. But since we do have Miss Dahmer here, Miss Dahmer, can you talk about what was it like as a teacher in a Rosenwald school? Could you can you share how big were the classes? How were the students engaged at a school like the Bay Springs School?
Well, we never saw a new book. We got all the hand-me-down books. We knew the name of other people's that went to the white school here. Well, we did the very best we could with the children we taught here. A lot of the children would learn, the younger children would learn from their older children. And by the time they got in the grade that the older children was in, they were really masters of their grade. Sometimes the older children would teach the younger children to help out with the school load. Because most time it was only one teacher or two teachers in the school system, and they had all the children to teach.
Okay.
I was looking at some history of this school. I never went to school there, but I was old enough to have memories of the school being here and actually coming out here on this site before it closed in 58. In 58, I would have been about 5 years old. So I have vague memories of it. But I saw a graduation picture that I sent to all of y'all from like 1953, where I think they had like maybe 12, maybe a dozen students that graduated out of this school. And that was during the time when it was 1 through 12. Yeah. And I was looking at a commencement program for another year, and they might have had 8 teachers, maybe, on that campus at that time to teach 1 through 12th grade. So I imagine some of the grades were being combined, first and second, third and fourth, that type thing, because you probably didn't have a whole lot of students who could attend, and most of them probably could not attend for the entire term, because this was a rural farming area where individuals were engaged in subsistence farming. So for a family to make it, the kids sometimes had to work on the farm. So they may not be able to go to school for a while, while they're trying to plant crops, harvest crops, or whatever. But when that was over with, they would come back to the school and the teachers would pick up with where they left off. Now, in talking with some of the folks who went to school here and my mother, obviously some of the students wasn't that well prepared, but the teachers met them wherever they were and picked up from there with them. So dedication, commitment to, hey, we're going to pick up with wherever you are in this process and move forward with you as far as we can. And I think it did folks a lot of good. This particular school right here, the Bay Springs School, you have some pretty significant people that come through here. Most people obviously know about my dad, but if you look up the history of this guy, Jesse Brown, the first naval aviator, fighter pilot back during the Korean conflict, he went to this school. Okay, come out of here, eventually got into better school, and from there into college, and he ended up in the Navy as an aviator. He was killed in combat in Korea. We had people who went to school here, went on and became medical doctors, went on to better schools and worked their way on through the system. People who went to school here became educators. Some of them went on and advanced through education and taught on the college level in places like Alcorn. Okay, I believe the band director that went to school here at one time in the grade school, who was from Hattiesburg, Sammy, whatever, I can't remember his last name, several years ago. So these schools were great. I can't call his last name. But, these schools, these Rosenwald schools were a tremendous platform for giving individuals an opportunity that they didn't have before, okay? So Julius Rosenwald was a guy I didn't know a whole lot about until I got involved heavily in trying to restore this school and start reading that history. But I would say he was a prime example of good, of what can be done with money, good things. You know, we have a lot of people get a lot of money and they do bad things, okay? But I would say he was a prime example of an individual who made a lot of money and he did good things with his money that made a significant change in the lives of Black folks, especially in the South, you know, and the Indians in the Southwest, the Native Americans.
Okay. I want to ask Mr. Feiler a question. It was interesting to me just reading the book and talking about learning about how these schools helped African-American communities and uplifted African-American communities. And we've talked about that today. We've talked about how they were used more than just education centers, but community centers, churches, things like that. And it was like a positive outlook in the Black communities. But how were white Southerners feeling about these education centers?
So the short answer is it changed over time. You have to remember, to go back to during slavery, literacy was outlawed. So that's the baseline. And at the end of the Civil War, there is this federal agency called the Freedmen's Bureau, which created schools all across the South. Schools were also, churches were created. Schools were created in these church halls. And there are these extraordinarily moving stories of people, young and old, walking for miles, morning, noon, and night to get to schools because they understood the power of education. And this is part of the essential history in the immediate years after the Civil War, and in the central question of how do we bring African Americans, freed slaves, fully into the promise of America. Education was that path. And so the Rosenwald School, of course, then we have the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction ends, Jim Crow sets in, and so that which is why you have this persistent Black-white education gap prior to the creation of the Rosenwald Schools program. At the beginning of the program, white contributions are welcomed, school board contributions are welcome, but in the beginning of the program, most of the funding comes from Julius Rosenwald and from the Black community. What happens over time is two things. Number one, Julius Rosenwald's contributions give the white school boards political cover. And there are some progressive reformers in the education establishments of the various Southern states who are really pushing for education for African Americans. And I'll give you one example. There was a man named James Hope, who was the state school superintendent in South Carolina. He donates, because of his vision and his understanding of the importance of education, there were Rosenwald schools in every county in South Carolina. One of those schools is the Hope School. Its photograph is in my book. It's named after him because he donated the land for the school. If you go to Washington, D.C. today, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you will see from the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina, 6 school desks, an original potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. So there were reformers like that. But the other thing that happens is the Great Migration. And as the Great Migration starts to accelerate, the white community starts to understand that in order to keep their workforce, they need to provide better educational outcomes and better educational opportunities. And so over time, the school boards contribute more and more. And so by the end of the program, Julius Rosenwald's contributions are actually only 15% of the total funding that goes into these schools. 64% comes from public funds. And only 4% came from the white community, just as philanthropic contributions. The Black community's contribution was 17%. So the Black community's made a big contribution. Julius Rosenwald has made a significant contribution, but public funding in the end ends up being very significant, largely in response to either a progressive impulse among certain Southern leaders in the field of education, or because of the Great Migration.
Gotcha. Before we get into Q&A, I just want to ask y'all one last question, and this is for everybody to answer. How many are left? What are the I think there were like over 600 in Mississippi alone that I know of. And so there were a lot of schools, and like you said, there was a school in every county in South Carolina at one time. So with all of that being said, are there any left, and then also how are they being used today?
Right.
We know about the Bay Spring schools because that's already been talked about, but
So I'll give you some. So there were 4,978 Rosenwald schools. Only about 500 are known to survive. Only half of those have been restored. In Mississippi, there were 557 Rosenwald schools. That's more than any state other than North Carolina, which had almost 800 schools. Of those 557 schools, I believe only about 13 are known to survive in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And most of those have not been restored. And so this is the challenge, right? Only 10% of these schools have survived. Only half of those have been restored. These are incredibly important monuments to the importance of education, to the commitment of the African-American community to education, to the understanding that this was the access point to the American dream. I want to add one thing to what Ms. Dahmer was talking about as a teacher. The teachers in these schools, these were Black teachers in Black schools. They taught equality. And by teaching equality, they helped set the expectation that all people should be created equal. And that became a huge driver of the leaders and the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. The second thing that the teachers did, and we actively talked about this while the Dahmers and I were meeting inside the Bay Spring School. When we think about Brown versus Board of Education, the litigation that leads to the Supreme Court desegregation orders of 1954 and 1955, we think about Thurgood Marshall and his team as the heroes. But Thurgood Marshall and his team relied on teachers who were part of teachers associations. Ms. Dahmer was one of those teachers, funneled data up to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It was that data, school level data, that helped Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers make the case that separate but equal was inherently unequal. And so the teachers not only are teaching equality, but they are some of the heroes of the civil rights movement for helping make that legal case possible. And Ms. Dahmer was one of those people funneling that data through the teachers association, Black teachers associations, up to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
So we're gonna go into Q&A now. So we've got a few questions in the chat. I'm gonna start off with a question that was asked: was Miss Dahmer a Gene supervisor? And how is the building currently used now? And I know you had kind of alluded to that, Mr. Dahmer, but was Miss Dahmer a Gene supervisor? I don't know what I'm not privy to what that means.
No, I was not a Gene supervisor.
Okay.
I started off as a home economic teacher, then I finally went to elementary education.
Okay. And also someone wanted to know, what was a typical school day like for you, Miss Dahmer?
Well, I started at 8 o'clock. Well, frankly, I got here about 7:30 in the morning. and getting everything ready for the children there, getting material ready for them to learn. Usually what we did, each teacher had 2 grades to teach. While I was teaching 1 grade, I gave the other one seat work to do. And while I was teaching the next grade, the next one had seat work to do. And like I said from the beginning, the older children would go back and help the teacher out by teaching the younger children.
Another question that I had was, someone asked, were any of these schools in Tennessee? Mr. Phil?
Yeah, there were the schools were in 15 states, the 11 states of the Confederacy. Tennessee was one of them. There were originally 354 schools in Tennessee. About 30 or so are known to survive. Beyond those 11 states of the Confederacy, there were schools also in Oklahoma, Missouri, which only had 3 schools because it ended the program very late, Kentucky, and Maryland.
Gotcha. So you brought up Brown v. Board of Education, and that didn't necessarily force schools to integrate right away, but eventually in this 1969, 1970, Brown 2 and all of that, and then here in Mississippi with Holmes v. Alexander, that really pushed for the integration of schools here in this state. But what was the difference between like the resources, because of a Rosenwald school and like a state-sponsored African-American school, because it kind of seemed like they were almost the same, maybe? It's just from what I gathered.
Well, so first of all, to your point, the response. So if you look in the book, when I have photographs of schools themselves, I have the name of the school because the names are just poetic, right? Bay Spring School is emblematic of the wonderful names that these schools had. And sometimes they're named after, like the Bay Spring School, features of the land. Sometimes they're named after churches because the churches raised the money. Sometimes they're named after prominent people in the community or prominent African Americans. There's a number of schools named after the poet Paul Dunbar. Then there's the county and the state, because the funds had to flow through these, had to be public schools. They were part of the county school system. And then the opening year and then the closing year. And the reason I put the closing year in there is to emphasize, John, exactly the question that you're asking. The response to Brown v. Board varied widely, not just by state, but often by local school jurisdictions. In some places, these schools closed in response to the Supreme Court orders in 1954 and 1955. In other cases, these schools were actively segregated schools into the late 1960s. And then some of them actually became integrated schools as some of the schools that survive today now are now these integrated schools. So it varies widely. Now I forgot the other part of your question.
You've answered it. I appreciate that. So I think that is kind of all we have in the chat. So I'm just going to ask one last question and give it back to our host. Just in your own words, and we can kind of do it shortly, just in a brief wrap up. But in your own words, how did Rosenwald Schools change America? How did they impact these small communities, and how did these small communities grow to change America? Just in your own short words, to wrap us up.
Would you like to start, Mom?
One thing the school did, it made us conscious of voting. That's one of the things these schools did, made us conscious of voting. The people who would go and make decisions for us were the ones who could vote. And when we finally got to the poll, where we could make a decision, it made a difference. If you don't believe it made a difference, go down to Forest County, Hattiesburg, Mississippi on Main Street, and you'll see that statue of Vernon Dahmer there. Like he's going up that step to help people to register to vote. Mississippi has changed.
to add to that, John, this is what I would say about this whole Rosenwald program. And that was part of it, the buildings. But there were other groups that worked in conjunction with Julius Rosenwald that helped to fund the teachers to work in the schools, okay? And that was just as important as the building. You know, you got to have educators. So I think what it did more than anything, it provided opportunity, it provided hope, and it showed a pathway of how, in spite of what you're dealing with, during that era of Jim Crowism, segregation, all of that was taking place in the Deep South, and all the atrocities that's being committed against Black folks, it showed that, hey, in spite of all of that, you can still improve yourself and move forward. And it really helped people to focus and understand that education can be a pathway to change your circumstance. And these schools provided that opportunity, that initial platform for a lot of individuals that said earlier, they started out in these schools, they leave this school, maybe get into a better school somewhere else. Then out of there, they maybe get into a college, into Alcorn or Jackson State or some of the schools up north and on the graduate schools. So it was that first step for a lot of folks. That's what these schools represented. The first step toward self-improvement. And really, your community improved too when the individuals got stronger in it.
And another thing, John, most of these families who went to school, as soon as one would get out of college, they would turn around and help the other one get out of college. This is how most of the Black students got through school. We didn't have no loans then. The loan was you work and help each other.
That's a great point you made. Thank you for that.
At
Mr.
one time, I had five of us in college at one time.
Five
Wow.
brothers and sisters.
Uh-huh.
Y'all
Wow.
helped each other work your way.
Yeah, three of them had just come from the service from the United States, World War II, and the government was paying that way, helping them pay that way. My sister and I was in school, we were working. I worked 2 jobs trying to get out of school.
Wow. Wow. Well, we definitely appreciate you and your family's contribution to education to others, and especially here in Mississippi. Mr. Feiler, would you like to add to that?
Well, that's a beautiful answer that the Dahmers both gave, and I thank them for that. Well, here's what I would add. We often think that problems in America are intractable in our frozen politics, particularly those problems related to race. And if you look at the heart of this program, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington reached across divides of race, of region, of religion, and they fundamentally changed this country for the better. And I think that there's an important lesson in that for all of us, that individual actions do matter, that we can change the world. And to all of those people today marching in the streets for social justice, running for political office, going to vote, our vote matters, our actions matter, we can make a difference, and we have to stay at it.
Thank you for that. Just real quick, one of the SNCC volunteers during the time that was you have picnic and everything at the farm and at the Bay Springs School. Dr. Doris Derby is actually listening in, and she actually was a part of her part of SNCC, and also did a literacy campaign and literacy project at Tougaloo College, creating various initiatives. But she had a question for you, Mr. Feiler. She wanted to know what are books and or other materials and information that continue to talk about, but besides your wonderful book, that continue to tell this information on Rosenwald schools and education for African-American children during Reconstruction and moving into the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple answers to that question. Let me just say about my book. My book is a book of photographs, but I came across such extraordinary stories, like the stories of the Dahmer family, that I was moved to write a story that goes with every photograph. And so there is a short, roughly 3 or 4 paragraph story that goes with every photograph, or in some cases, pairs of photographs in this book. So there's actually 16,000 words of stories. This is kind of a hybrid body of work in photography. It's photographs and stories. So there is a lot of content there. Secondly, I would say Stephanie Deutsch, who's an historian based in Washington, has written a very well-researched, very accessible book on the history of the Rosenwald Schools program called You Need a Schoolhouse. And then thirdly, there's a filmmaker based in Washington, D.C. named Aviva Kempner, who in late 2015 brought forth a documentary film called Rosenwald, which is about both the Rosenwald Schools program and also the Rosenwald Fellowships, which was another philanthropic initiative of Julius Rosenwald to give grants to African-American scientists, artists, public thinkers. And that's another very good source of information about this moment in our history.
Great. Well, I think that is all the time that we have. I want to thank all of you for joining in and interacting with me and the guests to talk about this wonderful information, this wonderful part of our history, our American history, and getting to learn more about specifically the Bay Springs School in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and Kelly Settlement. But I do want to thank the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and also thank you, Kara, for guiding us through this whole process. And it was really nice to meet you, Mr. Feiler, and it was good to see you again, Ms. Dahmer and Mr. Dahmer, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon.
Thank you all again. Thank you all again for joining us. It was a great conversation, and it is recorded, so it'll be up on our YouTube channel soon. It's also on Facebook because we had it going live. So just thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Thank you.